More than 1 billion years ago, almost every piece of land on Earth was fused into one enormous mass. No forests covered the ground, no animals walked across stone, not a single blade of grass, not a bird in the sky, not even an insect crawling through the dirt. Just bare rock, stretching endlessly beneath a pale sun, surrounded by one vast warm ocean. This world had a name, Rodinia. And unlike Pangea, the supercontinent most of us learned about in school, Rodinia left almost nothing behind. No clean outline, no agreed upon map, not even a confirmed shape. It may have held together for hundreds of millions of years, longer than dinosaurs ever walked the earth, and then it vanished so completely that even today, scientists cannot fully agree on what it looked like. What they have instead are fragments, worn down mountain roots, scattered pieces of ancient crust, faint magnetic traces locked inside stones, still pointing toward where they once sat on the planet. Every few years, someone finds a new clue, and the entire puzzle shifts again. Today, we're walking back across a world that left almost no trace, a lost supercontinent that refuses to stay still, even now. The image most people carry of a single ancient world is shaped by creatures that walked upon it. Vast reptiles, heavy footsteps, and familiar silhouettes give that world a kind of presence that feels almost within reach. Pangea settles easily into the imagination because it shares a stage with life that feels visible and immediate, preserved in bones that still hold their form. Its coastlines seem to echo in the modern map, continents that appear as though they might still fit together if gently pressed back into place. The rocks that tell Pangea's story have not traveled as far through time. They remain clearer, less altered, and more willing to reveal their patterns. Fossils align across oceans with a quiet certainty, matching shapes found on distant shores. Layers of sediment rest in sequences that can still be read without too much distortion. Even for those who never studied geology, the outlines feel intuitive, almost like a puzzle that has already been half solved. Rodinia does not offer that same immediate clarity. Its traces lie much deeper, in a world where the crust has been folded, heated, and reshaped over spans so long that original forms have softened or disappeared. The evidence exists, but it arrives in fragments that require careful reconstruction. Magnetic signatures linger in ancient minerals, yet they speak in directions rather than images. Mountain belts stretch across continents, but their connections must be inferred from scars that no longer align cleanly. Time itself becomes part of the difficulty. As ages pass, the surface of Earth is continually rewritten. Erosion removes entire landscapes, while new layers bury what remains. Heat and pressure alter the very structure of rocks, changing their composition and obscuring their origins. The deeper one looks into the past, the more the record feels like something that has been copied and recopied, each version losing a little of the original detail. This is why the earlier chapters of Earth's story feel distant in a different way. They are not simply older, they are quieter, less direct, and often incomplete. The absence of large, easily recognizable life forms adds to that distance. Without familiar anchors, the mind has fewer places to rest, fewer shapes to hold on to. The world becomes harder to picture, not because it lacked complexity, but because its complexity was expressed in forms that rarely fossilized in ways we easily recognize. Yet this difficulty carries its own kind of presence. The fact that Rodinia must be assembled from scattered clues gives it a texture that feels almost hidden beneath the surface of the planet. It is not a single image waiting to be uncovered, but a mosaic that emerges slowly, piece by piece from careful observation. Each fragment contributes something small, and only through their combination does the larger outline begin to appear. The contrast between these two worlds reveals something broader about Earth itself. Continents have not gathered into one configuration only once. They have come together and separated again across immense stretches of time, forming different arrangements that each left their own subtle marks. Pangea is simply the most recent expression of a much older rhythm, one that continues to shape the planet even now. Rodinia remains less familiar, not because it mattered less, but because it belongs to a chapter written in a language that is harder to read. Its story survives in altered stones, in faint alignments, in traces that require patience to interpret. That quiet distance gives it a different kind of weight, as though the planet is holding on to a memory that can only be approached slowly, never fully recovered in a single glance. Across spans of time too wide to measure in ordinary ways, the surface of Earth behaves less like something fixed and more like something that drifts, gathers, and slowly rearranges itself. The ground beneath oceans and continents is divided into immense pieces of crust that rest upon a deeper, warmer layer, moving at a pace so gradual it escapes notice within a human lifetime. Yet, given enough time, those movements shape entire worlds. A supercontinent forms during one of these long intervals, when most of those pieces come together into a single vast arrangement. Instead of being scattered across the globe, the majority of continental crust is drawn into one connected body. The edges meet, press, and align, creating a configuration where land is concentrated rather than dispersed. It is not an exact merging of every fragment, but it represents a moment when the balance shifts toward unity on a planetary scale. This gathering is not sudden. Continents travel slowly, often only a few centimeters each year, guided by processes far below the surface. Heat from the planet's interior rises and circulates, setting the overlying crust in motion. Over tens of millions of years, oceans narrow as opposing land masses approach one another. Where they meet, the crust thickens and reshapes, joining pieces that once lay far apart. What appears stable in a single era is part of a much longer sequence of change. Once assembled, a supercontinent can persist for an immense stretch of time. During this phase, the combined landmass influences the surrounding oceans, the movement of heat, and the patterns of the atmosphere. The arrangement is not static even then, but the overall structure holds together long enough for new geological features to develop across its breadth. It becomes a dominant expression of Earth's surface at that moment in its history. Yet no such arrangement remains intact forever. Beneath the surface, the same forces that brought continents together continue to act. Heat accumulates, stresses build, and the crust begins to respond. Over time, the unified landmass starts to weaken in certain regions. Subtle stretching gives way to deeper fractures, and the first separations begin. What was once connected slowly divides, opening new spaces that will eventually become oceans. This process of coming together and moving apart is not unique to any single supercontinent. It repeats across deep time in what is often described as a cycle, though it unfolds on scales so vast that each phase feels almost like its own world. Continents disperse, travel, and eventually gather again, forming new configurations that differ from those before. Each cycle leaves traces, shaping the structure of the crust and influencing the conditions that follow. Within this broader rhythm, Rodinia represents one of those moments when unity was reached. It was neither the beginning nor the end of the process, but a phase within an ongoing pattern that extends far beyond any single arrangement of land. The continents that composed it had their own histories before joining, and they would continue to change long after it no longer existed in that form. Seen in this way, a supercontinent is less a permanent feature and more a temporary gathering, a pause within a continuous motion. The land itself is never truly still. It shifts, assembles, and separates again, carrying with it the quiet memory of previous worlds, each one shaped by the same enduring forces, moving slowly beneath the surface. If one could stand upon the surface of Earth during that distant interval, the world would not feel like an earlier version of the present, but something altogether separate, shaped by conditions that no longer exist. The land would stretch in unfamiliar forms, bare and unadorned by the textures that now soften every horizon. There would be no forests to gather light, no grasses to ripple across open ground, no traces of animals moving across the terrain. The silence of the continents would feel vast, broken only by wind moving over exposed rock and the distant rhythm of water meeting the edges of stone. The absence of complex life on land gives this world a stark clarity. Soil, as it is known today, had not yet fully developed, since the processes that build it depend heavily on plant life. Without roots to break apart rock or organic layers to accumulate, much of the surface would appear raw, shaped primarily by physical forces rather than biological ones. Weathering still occurred, but it unfolded in a quieter, more gradual way, guided by temperature, water, and chemical reactions rather than living systems. Beyond the shores, the oceans held most of the planet's living activity. Within those waters, life existed in forms that were small, often microscopic, yet widespread and persistent. Simple, multicellular organisms had begun to appear, adding new structures and interactions to marine environments. Vast communities of microorganisms drifted, clustered, and settled across seafloors, participating in cycles that slowly altered the chemistry of the water around them. These forms did not leave behind dramatic fossils, yet their presence shaped the planet in subtle and lasting ways. The composition of the atmosphere differed as well, carrying a balance of gases that had been gradually changing over immense spans of time. Oxygen was present, but not at levels that would later support large, active animals. The sky, though still blue, may have carried a different quality of light, filtered through an atmosphere that had not yet reached its later state. Sunlight would fall upon a world where biological and geological processes were still adjusting to one another, forming a delicate interplay that would continue to evolve. Coastlines traced patterns that no modern map can easily resemble. The meeting points between land and sea shifted with tides, currents, and the slow movement of the crust itself. Shallow marine regions extended along the margins, creating environments where sediments could gather and preserve quiet records of change. These edges were among the few places where the interaction between land, ocean, and life became visible in layered form, even if those layers would later be altered by time. In this setting, the concept of familiarity begins to fade. Without the presence of recognizable plants or animals, the landscape resists easy comparison. It becomes less like a distant chapter of the same story and more like a parallel version of Earth, one that followed the same underlying rules but expressed them in ways that feel almost foreign. The rhythms of day and night continued, the oceans moved, and the crust shifted, yet the surface lacked the living patterns that now define the planet's character. Rodinia belongs to this world, shaped by these conditions and existing within them. Its presence does not sit comfortably within the images often associated with ancient Earth, because it formed during a time when the planet itself had not yet developed the features that later became familiar. In this way, it feels less like something that has been lost and more like something that existed in a different form of Earth entirely, one that can only be approached through careful reconstruction and quiet imagination. Long before the configuration that would later be called Rodinia began to take shape, the continents already carried histories etched into their foundations, traces of earlier unions that had come and gone in silence. These ancient fragments did not drift into place as blank pieces. Each one arrived with a memory of older encounters, shaped by collisions that had pressed them together in different arrangements across far earlier ages. Among those earlier gatherings, geologists often refer to a supercontinent known as Columbia, sometimes called Nuna. It existed hundreds of millions of years before Rodinia, forming its own vast configuration of continental crust. Though its outlines are even more difficult to trace, its presence lingers in the alignment of ancient rocks and in the ages recorded within deep crystalline cores. These clues suggest that Earth had already experienced a phase where much of its land was drawn together, only to later disperse once more. The pieces that would eventually contribute to Rodinia were once part of that older assembly. After Columbia began to fragment, those pieces moved away from one another, carried by the slow but persistent motion of the planet's surface. Oceans opened between them, reshaping the arrangement of land and sea. Over immense spans of time, these fragments did not remain isolated. They continued to travel, sometimes approaching new neighbors, sometimes drifting apart again, their paths guided by forces far beneath the surface. During this interval, Earth's surface was in a state of continuous adjustment. New boundaries formed where pieces of crust interacted, and older boundaries faded or were transformed. The continents themselves were not fixed shapes. They evolved as material was added, removed, or altered through ongoing geological processes. Each fragment became a mosaic of events, carrying layers of history that extended far beyond any single configuration. As time passed, conditions gradually shifted toward another phase of gathering. The same slow movements that had once pulled continents apart began to bring certain fragments closer again. These motions did not follow a simple or direct path. Instead, they unfolded over vast distances and timescales, with each approach shaped by the structure of the crust and the behavior of the deeper interior. What would later be recognized as Rodinia began to emerge from this gradual convergence, not as a sudden creation, but as the outcome of countless earlier motions. This long prelude gives Rodinia a different kind of presence. It does not stand alone as an isolated formation, but as part of an ongoing sequence that stretches deep into Earth's past. The continents that composed it had already been assembled and dispersed in previous configurations, and the patterns of their movement reflect that inherited complexity. Each connection within Rodinia carries echoes of earlier contacts, as if the planet were reusing familiar pieces in a new arrangement. Seen in this light, the formation of Rodinia becomes one moment within a much larger narrative. Earth had already been reshaping its surface for immense spans of time, cycling through phases of connection and separation long before this particular supercontinent appeared. The story does not begin with Rodinia, and it does not end there. Instead, it flows through it, linking older worlds to those that would follow. The ground beneath Rodinia was therefore not newly formed, but deeply layered with prior histories. Beneath its surface lay the remnants of older assemblies, preserved in structures that had endured through multiple cycles of change. These layers create a sense of continuity, a quiet reminder that every supercontinent is built upon the remains of those that came before, each one part of a much older planetary rhythm that continues without pause. The reconstruction begins not with a map, but with fragments that seem unrelated at first glance, scattered across continents that no longer share a common edge. Scientists approach these fragments the way a careful reader approaches a damaged manuscript, aware that meaning survives even when the pages are incomplete. Each piece carries a trace of position, movement, or connection, and together they form a record that can be assembled with patience. One of the quietest clues lies within the minerals of certain rocks, where tiny magnetic signatures were fixed at the moment those rocks formed. As molten material cooled or sediments settled, particles aligned with the direction of Earth's magnetic field at that time. Once locked in place, that orientation remained, even as the continents carrying those rocks shifted across the globe. By measuring these preserved directions, researchers can estimate where a piece of crust once sat relative to the planet's magnetic poles, offering a sense of latitude long after the original setting has changed. This magnetic memory does not reveal a complete picture on its own, yet it narrows the possibilities. When similar patterns appear across distant regions, they suggest that those areas may once have shared a position or moved along related paths. These alignments act as quiet constraints, shaping how the ancient world can be imagined without fixing it into a single, rigid form. Elsewhere, the structure of the crust itself offers another layer of evidence. Mountain belts, formed through the compression and uplift of colliding landmasses, can extend across present-day continents that are now separated by vast oceans. When geologists compare the age, composition, and orientation of these ranges, they sometimes find matches that feel less like coincidence and more like continuity. It becomes possible to place these belts side by side in reconstruction, as though reconnecting a seam that has long since been pulled apart. Sedimentary layers add further detail, preserving environments that once existed along ancient margins or within interior basins. The types of sediments, the conditions under which they formed, and the sequences in which they appear can reveal whether two regions experienced similar histories at the same time. Minerals within these layers carry chemical signatures that reflect the conditions of their formation, allowing comparisons that extend beyond visible structure into deeper processes. The ages of rocks provide an additional guide. By determining when different pieces of crust formed or were altered, scientists can begin to assemble a timeline that links separate regions. When ages align across distant areas, it suggests a shared event or period of connection. When they differ, it hints at separation or distinct histories. These temporal markers help refine the arrangement, adding a sense of sequence to the emerging reconstruction. All of these methods come together gradually, each contributing a portion of the larger picture. None of them alone can define the full outline of a supercontinent like Rodinia. Instead, they overlap and intersect, building a model that remains open to revision as new data appears. The process is careful and iterative, shaped by evidence that must be interpreted rather than directly observed. In this way, Rodinia exists not as a preserved landscape waiting to be uncovered, but as a reconstruction drawn from multiple lines of inquiry. Its form is inferred, adjusted, and debated, reflecting both the strength of the evidence and the limits of what can be known from such deep time. The result carries a quiet uncertainty, a sense that the world being described is real, yet never fully fixed, held together by clues that invite continued exploration rather than final resolution. Within certain stones, there exists a quiet alignment that formed at the moment of their creation, a subtle ordering that reflects the invisible structure of the planet itself. When molten rock cools or fine particles settle through still water, tiny minerals respond to Earth's magnetic field, turning ever so slightly until they match its direction. As the rock hardens or the sediment compacts, that orientation becomes fixed, held in place long after the surrounding world begins to change. This faint imprint acts as a kind of internal compass, preserved across immense spans of time. Though the continents carrying these rocks may drift, fold, or fracture, the original magnetic alignment remains locked within the mineral grains. By carefully measuring this orientation, scientists can recover a sense of where that piece of crust once rested in relation to the planet's magnetic framework. It does not reveal a full location in the way a modern map would, yet it offers a directional memory, a quiet hint of ancient position. When many such measurements are gathered from rocks of similar age, patterns begin to emerge. These patterns can be compared across distant regions, allowing researchers to see whether separate fragments may once have shared a similar latitude or followed a related path. Over time, a broader picture takes shape, not as a single image, but as a set of overlapping possibilities that guide how the past can be arranged. Even so, this method carries its own limits. The magnetic field of Earth is not constant in its exact configuration over deep time. It shifts, reverses, and wanders, leaving behind a record that must be interpreted with care. Rocks themselves are not always perfect archives. Heat, pressure, and chemical change can alter their internal structure, sometimes modifying or partially erasing the original magnetic signal. In very old formations, these alterations become more likely, adding layers of uncertainty to the readings. There is also a subtle absence within this kind of evidence. While magnetic orientation can suggest latitude, it does not directly reveal longitude, leaving an entire dimension of position open to interpretation. This means that even when scientists can estimate how far north or south a continent once lay, its exact placement around the globe remains less certain. Multiple configurations can satisfy the same magnetic data, each one consistent in part, yet differing in detail. Because of this, paleomagnetism does not produce a single definitive reconstruction. Instead, it acts as a framework that constrains what is possible. It reduces the range of acceptable arrangements, guiding researchers away from unlikely configurations while still leaving room for variation. Other lines of evidence must be brought in to refine the picture further, each contributing its own piece to the larger whole. In the case of Rodinia, this quiet uncertainty becomes especially pronounced. The rocks that hold these magnetic traces have endured immense spans of time, increasing the chances that their original signals have been altered or obscured. As a result, different interpretations can emerge from the same underlying data, each shaped by how the evidence is weighed and combined. This does not weaken the reconstruction, but rather defines its character. The ancient magnetic record offers direction without finality, a set of constraints that shape the search without closing it. Through this method, Rodinia takes form as a world inferred through careful balance, where the lines are drawn with confidence in some places and with gentle caution in others, reflecting the depth of time that separates that world from the present. There is a fragment of Earth that feels more stable than most, a piece of crust that has endured through immense spans of time, with its identity still partly intact. Beneath the landscapes of much of present-day North America lies this ancient core, known as Laurentia. It is not defined by modern borders or coastlines, but by deep crystalline foundations that have survived repeated cycles of change, preserving a sense of continuity that reaches far into the past. Laurentia carries within it some of the oldest rocks on the continent, regions where the crust thickened and stabilized early in Earth's history. These areas, often referred to as cratons, form a kind of geological backbone, resisting the more intense reshaping that affects younger or more active zones. Because of this durability, Laurentia retains a clearer record of its earlier positions and movements than many other fragments of the crust. When scientists attempt to reconstruct Rodinia, Laurentia often becomes a central reference point. Its ancient rocks preserve consistent patterns that can be compared across time, offering a stable foundation upon which other pieces can be arranged. Rather than shifting it freely within each model, researchers frequently place Laurentia near the core of the supercontinent, allowing surrounding fragments to be positioned relative to it. This role as an anchor does not arise from preference, but from the strength of the evidence contained within its structure. The magnetic signatures preserved in its rocks, combined with the continuity of its geological features, provide a framework that is more constrained than that of many other regions. By holding Laurentia steady, it becomes easier to test how other continental pieces might align, reducing the number of possible configurations that need to be considered. Around its margins, the outlines of past connections begin to emerge. Edges that are now separated by oceans show signs of once having been joined to distant lands. The composition of rocks, the timing of geological events, and the shapes of ancient boundaries all suggest that other cratonic fragments were once attached to Laurentia's sides. These attachments did not occur in a single arrangement that is universally agreed upon, but several patterns appear repeatedly across different reconstructions. Some models place regions that would later become parts of Australia or Antarctica along one edge, while others suggest connections to fragments that now form portions of South America or Northern Europe. Each arrangement reflects a careful balancing of evidence, where similarities in rock types and ages are weighed against the constraints provided by magnetic data and structural features. The result is not a fixed map, but a set of plausible configurations, each anchored by the presence of Laurentia at its center. This central position offers a rare point of familiarity within an otherwise unfamiliar world. While the surrounding pieces may shift from one reconstruction to another, the idea of a recognizable core provides a way to approach the ancient landscape. It allows the mind to begin forming a picture, starting from something that still exists today and extending outward into arrangements that no longer remain. In this way, Laurentia serves as both a physical foundation and a conceptual guide. It grounds the reconstruction of Rodinia in something tangible, even as the full shape of that supercontinent remains open to interpretation. The ancient core beneath North America becomes a quiet reference, a stable presence around which the rest of that distant world can be carefully and thoughtfully imagined. Around that enduring core, other fragments gather in the imagination, each one carrying its own deep history, each one once separate, then drawn close in ways that no longer match the present world. These pieces are not the continents as they are known today, but older building blocks, cratonic regions that now form parts of larger landmasses. Names like Baltica, Amazonia, Australia, and Antarctica refer to these ancient sections, each representing a foundation that existed long before their modern outlines took shape. What appears today as a single continent is often a patchwork assembled over immense spans of time. Edges that now seem continuous were once boundaries, places where different pieces met and fused together. Within these larger forms, older cores remain, preserving the memory of earlier positions. This mosaic nature becomes more visible when looking back toward Rodinia, where those pieces were arranged in ways that do not resemble their current relationships. In some reconstructions, Baltica, a region that would later contribute to parts of northern Europe, is placed against one side of Laurentia, its ancient edges aligned through matching geological features. Amazonia, which now forms part of South America, is sometimes positioned along a different margin, suggesting a connection that feels unfamiliar when compared to the modern map. Australia and Antarctica, now separated by wide oceans and polar distances, are often drawn close together, sometimes linked along stretches of crust that hint at earlier proximity. These arrangements do not settle into a single agreed upon image. Instead, they shift subtly depending on how the evidence is interpreted. One model may place a fragment slightly rotated or moved along a different edge, while another adjusts its position to better match a separate line of data. The variations are not random, but they reflect the delicate balance between multiple types of evidence, each offering its own constraints and possibilities. As these pieces are brought together, the emerging map carries a sense of both coherence and uncertainty. Some connections appear strong, supported by several lines of evidence that align in a consistent way. Others remain more tentative, suggested by partial matches that leave room for alternative interpretations. The result is not a single definitive image, but a collection of closely related versions, each one capturing a different way the fragments might have fit. This shifting arrangement gives Rodinia a quality that feels almost unfinished, not because it lacked structure, but because the reconstruction itself remains open. The pieces seem to hover in relation to one another, their edges suggesting contact, their interiors carrying records of past environments that hint at shared histories. Yet the exact way they joined cannot be fixed with complete certainty. The unfamiliarity of these connections adds to the sense of distance. Regions that now lie far apart are imagined side by side, their boundaries touching in ways that challenge the intuition shaped by the modern world. It becomes clear that the current arrangement of continents is only one expression among many, a temporary configuration within a much longer sequence. In this gathering of ancient fragments, Rodinia takes on the form of a puzzle whose pieces are known but not fully locked into place. Each reconstruction offers a glimpse, a careful attempt to restore a world that no longer exists in its original form. The beauty of the map lies not in its finality, but in its openness, where each piece invites closer study and the whole remains just beyond complete resolution. Before any outline could be imagined, the surface of Earth entered a long period of approach where distant fragments moved toward one another across narrowing expanses of ocean. The motion was steady and nearly imperceptible in any single moment, yet over vast stretches of time it carried entire continents into contact. The spaces between them, once filled with deep water, began to shrink as the crust beneath those oceans was drawn downward and consumed. Where these waters disappeared, the edges of continents met with increasing force. The crust did not yield easily. Instead, it resisted, thickened, and folded as the opposing masses pressed together. Layers of rock were lifted and compressed, rising into extensive belts that marked the zones of contact. These regions carried the imprint of immense pressure, recording the meeting of land that had traveled far to arrive at the same place. Such encounters did not occur in isolation. They formed a sequence, each collision linking one fragment to another, gradually building a larger and more continuous landmass. One connection would stabilize, then another would follow, extending the growing structure outward. The process unfolded across different regions at different times, creating a chain of events that spanned hundreds of millions of years. During these mergers, the boundaries between continents were transformed. What had once been separate edges became internal zones within a single, larger body of crust. The traces of those former boundaries remained, preserved in the altered rocks and structural patterns that marked the sites of collision. Over time, these zones became part of the interior, no longer exposed as active edges, yet still carrying the memory of their formation. As more fragments joined, the overall shape of Rodinia began to take form, though never in a single instant. It emerged gradually, the result of many separate unions rather than a single defining event. Each addition altered the balance of the growing landmass, influencing how subsequent pieces would attach and how the structure would evolve. The assembly was cumulative, shaped by a sequence of interactions that built upon one another. The forces involved in these collisions operated at a scale that is difficult to fully grasp. Entire sections of crust were driven together, their motion powered by processes deep within the planet. The energy released during these encounters reshaped vast regions, altering the thickness and composition of the crust. Yet despite this intensity, the process remained slow, unfolding over timescales that far exceed human experience. Within this gradual convergence, the idea of sudden formation gives way to a more extended narrative. Rodinia did not appear as a completed entity at a single moment in time. Instead, it developed through a prolonged series of mergers, each one contributing to the larger whole. The final configuration represents the culmination of these events, a temporary unity formed from many earlier connections. The resulting landmass carried within it the record of its own construction. Beneath its surface lay the remnants of each collision, layered and intertwined. These records reveal that the assembly of Rodinia was not a simple joining, but a complex process of interaction, where fragments met, adjusted, and became part of something larger. In this way, the creation of Rodinia reflects a pattern that is both dynamic and continuous. The planet does not assemble its continents in a single act, but through a sequence of encounters that unfold over immense spans of time. The great collisions that built this supercontinent were part of that ongoing motion, shaping a world that would exist for a time before continuing its slow transformation. At the zones where continents once met, the crust responded by thickening far beyond its usual state, rising into immense ranges that marked the lines of contact. These mountains were not gentle uplifts, but the result of sustained compression, where layers of rock were shortened, folded, and driven upward as opposing masses continued to converge. The process reshaped vast regions, creating elevated terrains that could stretch across distances far greater than any single modern range. Within these ancient belts, the rocks bear clear signs of the forces that formed them. Minerals were altered under intense pressure and temperature, their internal structures changing as the crust was buried and reheated. Layers that had once been horizontal were bent into complex patterns, recording the direction and intensity of movement. These transformations reveal that the meeting of continents is not a simple joining, but a deep reworking of the crust itself. Such mountain systems provide some of the most compelling evidence for past connections between distant regions. When geologists examine the structure, composition, and age of these belts across separate continents, they sometimes find striking similarities. The alignment of these features suggests that they were once part of the same continuous range, later divided as the landmass broke apart. By tracing these correspondences, it becomes possible to reconnect fragments that no longer share a common boundary. Yet, the mountains that formed during Rodinia's assembly have not remained as they once were. Over immense spans of time, the surface of Earth has continued to evolve, gradually wearing down even the largest elevations. Wind, water, and chemical processes have eroded the peaks, carrying away material and redistributing it across other regions. In many cases, what remains of these ancient ranges lies far below the original height, reduced to lower relief or buried beneath younger layers. tectonic activity has further altered these structures. Later, movements of the crust have folded, faulted, or partially melted sections of the original mountain belts, modifying their appearance and obscuring their origins. In some places, the evidence has been fragmented or displaced, making it more difficult to trace the full extent of the original range. What survives is often incomplete, a set of clues that must be carefully interpreted to reveal the earlier configuration. Despite these changes, the remnants of these mountains continue to carry the imprint of their formation. Even when reduced to subdued landscapes or hidden beneath the surface, their internal structures preserve a record of the forces that once acted upon them. These records provide a connection to a time when the continents were joined, offering insight into how those connections were established. The presence of these ancient belts suggests that the surface of Earth retains traces of its earlier forms, even as those forms have been reshaped beyond easy recognition. The mountains that once marked the assembly of Rodinia have not vanished entirely. They persist as altered remnants embedded within the crust and carrying forward the memory of their origin. In this way, the story of Rodinia remains written into the structure of the planet itself. The great ranges that rose during its formation have been transformed, yet they continue to exist in modified form, preserving evidence of a world that no longer appears on the surface. These enduring features serve as quiet markers of past connections, indicating that even when landscapes change, the deeper record of their formation can still be found. No single image can fully hold the shape of Rodinia. When scientists attempt to draw its outline, they produce maps that resemble one another in broad ways, yet differ in the placement of key fragments, the angles of connection, and the arrangement of surrounding seas. Each reconstruction reflects a careful reading of the available evidence, shaped by how different lines of data are balanced against one another. The result is a collection of visions rather than a single agreed-upon form, each one offering a slightly different way to imagine the same distant world. In all of these versions, the surface would appear unfamiliar, with coastlines that do not resemble any pattern seen today. The edges of the land would trace paths that have long since been erased or transformed, creating boundaries that feel both intricate and uncertain. Bays, peninsulas, and continental margins would exist in configurations that have no modern counterpart, shaped by processes that unfolded under conditions very different from those of the present. Toward the interior, the scale of the landmass becomes more apparent. With so much continental crust gathered together, large regions would lie far from the influence of the surrounding oceans. These interior areas would experience environments shaped by distance, where the moderating effects of nearby water were reduced. The contrast between the outer edges and the inner expanses would create a varied landscape, defined not only by geography, but by the distribution of climate and resources across the surface. Along the outer margins, the land met a vast body of water that some reconstructions describe as a global ocean, often referred to as Morovia. This ocean would have extended around much of the supercontinent, forming a continuous boundary between the gathered land and the rest of the planet's surface. Its presence adds another layer to the reconstruction, suggesting a world where the majority of open water was concentrated beyond the edges of a single, dominant landmass. Even with these broad features in mind, the exact arrangement remains fluid. The positions of individual fragments can shift slightly depending on how the evidence is interpreted, altering the shape of the coastline and the relationship between neighboring regions. Some models place certain blocks closer together, while others separate them, creating variations that ripple across the entire map. These differences are often subtle, yet they reflect deeper uncertainties about how the pieces once fit. This variability gives Rodinia a quality that resists final definition. It cannot be reduced to a single, fixed outline because the evidence allows for more than one plausible configuration. Instead, it exists as a range of possibilities, each one grounded in observation, yet open to revision as new data emerges. The map becomes something that is continually refined rather than something that can be fully completed. Within this shifting framework, the scale of the supercontinent remains consistent. Regardless of the exact arrangement, the gathering of so much land into one place creates a sense of magnitude that defines the reconstruction. The boundaries may move slightly, the connections may be adjusted, but the overall presence of a vast, unified landmass remains. Rodinia, in this sense, is best understood as a form that is both grand and uncertain. Its outline can be traced in multiple ways, each one revealing a different aspect of the same ancient configuration. The world it represents feels expansive and unfamiliar, not because it is entirely unknowable, but because it exists at the edge of what can be reconstructed from the traces left behind. When land gathers into a single expanse, distance itself begins to shape the behavior of the planet. The edges remain in contact with surrounding waters, but the interior stretches far beyond that influence, forming regions where the presence of the ocean is no longer immediate. Air that moves inward must travel great lengths before reaching the center, and along that journey, it gradually loses the moisture it once carried. As a result, the inner portions of such a landmass can become markedly different from its outer margins. Precipitation diminishes with distance, leaving vast areas where rainfall is infrequent and conditions grow increasingly dry. These interiors are not empty, but they are defined by a scarcity of water that shapes the landscape in subtle ways. Surfaces may weather slowly, and the processes that depend on consistent moisture become less prominent. Near the coasts, the situation is different. There, the interaction between land and ocean creates environments where water is more readily available. Moist air rises, cools, and returns as precipitation, supporting a set of conditions distinct from those found deeper inland. These contrasting zones develop side by side within the same continuous landmass, separated not by barriers, but by distance alone. The presence of such a large expanse of land also influences how air circulates across the planet. Winds are guided by differences in temperature and pressure, and when a continent reaches a certain scale, it alters those gradients in significant ways. Heating of the land during daylight hours can create broad areas of rising air, while cooler regions may draw air inward, setting up patterns that extend across large distances. These movements become part of a system shaped not only by the rotation of the planet and the energy from the sun, but also by the distribution of land itself. Rainfall patterns follow these shifts in circulation. Regions closer to the edges may experience more regular cycles of precipitation, while interior zones remain drier due to the limited reach of moisture-bearing winds. Over time, these patterns establish a range of environments within the same landmass, each influenced by its position relative to the surrounding ocean and the pathways of the atmosphere. Heat distribution is also affected. Large bodies of water tend to moderate temperature, absorbing and releasing heat more slowly than land. When much of the planet's surface is dominated by a single continental mass, that moderating influence is reduced over wide areas. Temperatures can vary more strongly between day and night and across different regions of the interior. These variations contribute to the overall diversity of conditions across the land. Taken together, these effects reveal how the arrangement of continents can shape the character of the planet's surface. A supercontinent is not only a collection of land, but a feature that interacts with the atmosphere and oceans, influencing how energy and moisture move across the globe. The size of the landmass becomes a factor in determining climate, creating patterns that differ from those of a more dispersed configuration. Within Rodinia, these processes would have unfolded across an immense interior where the influence of distant coasts diminished gradually with distance. The land itself would have participated in shaping the conditions that existed upon it, forming a system in which geography and climate were closely linked. The scale of the continent becomes evident not only in its extent, but in its ability to guide the movement of air, the distribution of moisture, and the flow of heat across the surface. Along the outer reaches of that vast land, the character of the world changes again, not through distance alone, but through contact. Here the solid surface meets moving water, and in that meeting, a different kind of record begins to form. The edges of continents are never still. Waves advance and retreat, currents carry fine particles, and layers settle gradually in places where land gives way to sea. These margins become zones of accumulation, where sediments gather over long periods. Grains of sand, fragments of minerals, and remains of microscopic life settle into basins that develop along the boundary. Each layer rests upon the one before it, creating sequences that reflect the conditions present at the time of deposition. Over immense spans, these layers can thicken into extensive formations, preserving a history that unfolds in quiet succession. The importance of these coastal regions lies in their sensitivity to change. Shifts in sea level, whether from global processes or local movement of the crust, alter where water meets land. When the sea advances, it covers areas that were once exposed, leaving behind deposits that reflect deeper conditions. When it retreats, new surfaces are revealed and different types of sediments begin to form. These changes are recorded in the arrangement of layers, creating patterns that can be read long after the original shoreline has disappeared. In addition to these gradual movements, the edges of continents are often the sites of more dynamic processes. As the crust stretches or adjusts, it can create rift zones where the land begins to thin and separate. In such areas, basins deepen, allowing thicker accumulations of sediment to build. These basins act as repositories, capturing material that reflects both the environment above and the processes occurring below. The structure of these deposits can reveal whether the crust was stable, subsiding, or undergoing more active transformation. Chemical signals within these sediments add further detail. The composition of minerals, the presence of certain elements, and the textures within the layers all carry information about the conditions at the time of formation. Changes in ocean chemistry, variations in sediment supply, and shifts in climate can all leave subtle traces within these deposits. When examined carefully, they provide insight into the broader systems that were operating along the margins. Because these regions lie at the interface between land and water, they often preserve a more continuous record than the interior. While inland areas may be subject to erosion or later alteration, coastal basins can protect their layers beneath subsequent deposits. This protection allows sequences to remain intact over long periods, offering a more detailed account of change through time. In the context of Rodinia, these ancient shorelines become especially significant. The positions of the continents have changed, and the original margins are no longer located where they once were. Yet the sediments that formed along those edges remain, now embedded within different parts of the crust. By identifying and comparing these deposits across separate regions, scientists can trace connections that reveal how the continents were once arranged. The shores of this distant world are therefore not lost entirely. They persist as layered records preserved within the rock, carrying the imprint of shifting seas and evolving landscapes. Through these quiet accumulations, the boundaries of Rodinia can be approached, not as fixed lines, but as zones of interaction where the planet recorded its own changing form. In that distant age, the living world unfolded mostly beyond sight, carried in forms so small that their presence is known more through traces than through shape. The surface of the oceans held drifting communities of microscopic organisms suspended within layers of water where light could still reach. These minute forms gathered energy, reproduced, and spread across vast areas, forming networks of life that covered the seas without leaving behind the kind of remains that are easily recognized. Beneath the surface, more structured communities developed along the seafloor. Thin layers of microbial life grew across sediments, binding grains together and creating textured surfaces that recorded their presence. In some places, these communities built low, layered formations, rising slowly as new material accumulated. Though modest in height, they represent some of the most enduring records of early life, preserved in patterns that reveal both growth and persistence over long intervals. Alongside these microbial worlds, simple multicellular organisms had begun to appear. These forms lacked the complexity that would later define animal life, yet they introduced new ways of organizing cells into larger structures. Their bodies were soft and rarely preserved in detail, but their existence marks a shift toward increased biological complexity. They lived primarily within the oceans, where conditions supported their development and where their interactions added new dimensions to the existing ecosystems. The absence of more complex animals gives this period a distinctive character. There were no creatures with hard skeletons, no rapid movements across the seafloor, and no intricate food webs built upon predation in the way later systems would develop. Instead, life operated through slower processes, with energy passing through communities in forms that were less visible but still effective. The rhythms of growth, decay, and renewal continued, shaped by organisms that interacted on scales both small and subtle. Within this environment, the ocean served as the primary stage for biological activity. They provided stability, nutrients, and a medium through which organisms could disperse. Currents carried microscopic life across great distances, connecting regions that would otherwise remain isolated. The seafloor offered surfaces for communities to establish themselves, while the water columns supported drifting populations that moved with the flow. The chemistry of these waters also played a role in shaping life. Elements dissolved in the ocean influenced how organisms functioned, affecting processes such as energy capture and cellular structure. Over time, interactions between living systems and their environment contributed to gradual changes, creating feedbacks that would influence future developments. These shifts occurred slowly, unfolding over spans far longer than any single generation. Seen from a distance, this world of life appears both simple and expansive. It lacks the visible diversity that later periods would bring, yet it is far from empty. Instead, it is filled with activity that operates at a scale that is easy to overlook. The absence of familiar forms does not indicate a lack of life, but rather a different expression of it, one that emphasizes continuity and persistence over complexity. Rodinia existed within this biological setting, shaped by and contributing to the conditions that supported these forms of life. The living world at that time does not align with the images often associated with ancient Earth, because it represents a stage that came before the rise of more complex organisms. It is a world where life is present in abundance, yet remains largely unseen, unfolding quietly within the oceans that covered much of the planet. Water covering much of the planet carried more than motion and depth. It carried a changing mixture of dissolved elements that shifted over long spans of time. The oceans were not fixed in their composition, even though their surface might have appeared steady. Within them, subtle transformations unfolded, guided by processes that linked land, atmosphere, and the deeper interior of the planet. Material from the continents gradually entered the sea through weathering, as exposed rock interacted with air and water. Minerals broke down, releasing ions that were carried by rivers and currents into the oceans. This steady input altered the balance of substances within the water, adding new components while changing the concentration of those already present. The pace of this change was slow yet persistent, shaping the chemical character of the ocean over immense durations. At the same time, volcanic activity contributed its own influence. Beneath the oceans and along certain regions of the crust, molten material rose and interacted with seawater, releasing gases and minerals. These contributions did not occur everywhere at once, but where they did, they introduced new elements that could shift local and global conditions. The interaction between hot rock and ocean water created environments where chemistry was continually adjusted, adding complexity to the overall system. Processes at the seafloor also played a role. As oceanic crust formed and moved, it interacted with surrounding water, exchanging materials in ways that affected both. Some elements were removed from the water and incorporated into solid structures, while others were released back into circulation. This exchange created a dynamic balance where the composition of the ocean was influenced by the ongoing renewal and alteration of the seafloor itself. The arrangement of the continents further shaped these patterns. When large portions of land were gathered together, the pathways through which water circulated around them changed. Currents shifted, influencing how nutrients and dissolved elements were distributed. Regions closer to continental margins might receive a different mixture of materials than more open areas, creating variations within the ocean that reflected the underlying geography. These chemical changes mattered deeply for the living systems that depended on the ocean. Microorganisms and simple multicellular forms relied on the availability of certain elements to carry out their processes. Variations in nutrient levels could influence how these organisms grew, reproduced, and interacted with one another. Over time, the relationship between life and ocean chemistry became intertwined, with each influencing the other in a gradual exchange. As organisms carried out their functions, they contributed to the composition of the water around them. Some removed elements from the ocean, incorporating them into their structures, while others released byproducts that altered the surrounding chemistry. These biological activities added another layer to the system, creating feedbacks that extended across long periods. Within the time of Rodinia, these processes were still evolving, shaping a planet that had not yet reached the conditions seen in later eras. The oceans reflected this ongoing development, holding a composition that was neither fixed nor final. Instead, they formed part of a larger system in transition, where physical and biological processes worked together to create gradual change. The surface of the ocean may have seemed calm, but beneath that appearance, a quiet transformation was always underway. The chemistry of the water shifted in response to forces both above and below, linking continents, volcanic activity, and life into a single, evolving system. Far beneath the surface, beyond the reach of oceans and continents, the planet remains in constant motion, shaped by heat that has never fully faded since its earliest formation. This deep interior does not behave as a rigid foundation, but as a slowly moving system where material circulates over immense spans of time. The crust above, though it appears solid and stable, rests upon this shifting layer, carried along by forces that operate far below direct observation. Within this deeper region, heat rises from the interior and begins a gradual ascent, while cooler material, nearer the surface, sinks in response. This continuous exchange creates a pattern of movement, often described as convection, though its pace is so slow that it unfolds beyond ordinary perception. Over millions of years, these motions guide the positions of continents, nudging them across the surface in ways that only become visible when viewed across vast stretches of time. The continents themselves are not independent travelers. They are bound to sections of the crust that respond to these deeper movements. As the mantle circulates, it exerts subtle forces on the overlying plates, influencing their direction and speed. Some regions are drawn together, while others are pulled apart, creating the shifting patterns that shape the arrangement of land across the planet. This relationship between the surface and the interior is not one-sided. When continents gather into a single large configuration, they can affect the flow of heat beneath them. A vast landmass may act as a kind of insulating layer, altering how heat escapes from the interior. Over time, this can influence the patterns of convection below, changing the pathways along which material rises and sinks. As heat accumulates beneath such a configuration, the balance of forces can shift. Regions of the crust may begin to experience stress as the underlying motion adjusts to the presence of the supercontinent above. These stresses can lead to gradual weakening, creating zones where the crust becomes more susceptible to separation. In this way, the same processes that helped bring continents together may also contribute to their eventual dispersal. The interaction between mantle motion and surface configuration forms a cycle that unfolds over immense durations. Continents gather, altering the flow of heat beneath them, and that altered flow can in turn encourage the conditions that lead to breakup. The process is not immediate, nor is it uniform, but it reflects a deep connection between the interior of the planet and the surface features that emerge above. During the time of Rodinia, this interplay was ongoing, shaping the behavior of the supercontinent even as it appeared unified. Beneath its surface, heat continued to move, circulation persisted, and forces remained active. The land above may have formed a continuous mass, yet it rested upon a foundation that was never at rest. This underlying activity gives Rodinia a sense of quiet motion even in its most stable phases. The continents that composed it were carried by processes that did not pause, guided by currents of heat and material that continued their slow circulation. The surface expression of unity existed alongside an interior that was constantly shifting, setting the stage for changes that would unfold over time. In this way, the supercontinent was not a fixed entity, but part of a system in motion, shaped by forces that extended far below the visible world. The heat within the planet remained an active presence, guiding the movement of continents and ensuring that even the largest configurations were only temporary expressions within a much longer process. At some point within that long period of unity, the pattern begins to change in ways that are not immediately visible at the surface. The land remains continuous, its boundaries still joined, yet subtle tensions gather beneath it. The same forces that once guided fragments together do not come to rest. They continue to act, pressing, pulling, and adjusting the crust in response to movements deep below. These changes begin quietly, expressed first as a gentle stretching of the surface. The crust, though strong, is not unyielding. Under sustained stress, it can thin and extend, creating regions where its thickness is gradually reduced. This stretching does not occur everywhere at once. It develops in specific zones, often following lines of weakness or areas where earlier events have left the crust more susceptible to change. As these zones extend, the surface begins to respond in ways that leave lasting marks. Fractures form, initially narrow and discontinuous, then widening as the process continues. These fractures define the early stages of rifting, where a once stable landmass begins to separate along distinct lines. The movement remains slow, measured over immense spans, yet it carries the first clear indication that the unity of the supercontinent is no longer secure. Beneath these stretching regions, the interior of the planet plays an active role. Heat rising from below can accumulate beneath areas of thinning crust, further weakening them. In some cases, this heat leads to the ascent of molten material, which moves upward through fractures and zones of reduced thickness. When it reaches higher levels, it can solidify within the crust or emerge at the surface, marking the presence of deeper activity. This interaction between stretching and rising heat creates a landscape that begins to differ from the rest of the supercontinent. The crust in these regions may sink slightly as it thins, forming elongated basins that run along the developing rift zones. These basins can collect sediments over time, preserving evidence of the changing conditions. The margins of the continent, once more stable, start to evolve into edges that are gradually being pulled apart. The process does not unfold as a sudden break. It is a gradual unmaking, where the integrity of the land is weakened step by step. Each fracture, each zone of thinning, contributes to a larger pattern that only becomes clear when viewed across vast durations. What appears as isolated changes in one era may later be recognized as part of a continuous system of separation. In Rodinia, these early signs of fracture marked the beginning of a transition. The supercontinent, once assembled through long sequences of collision, began to respond to forces that would eventually lead to its division. The land remained connected, yet the foundations of that connection were being altered, preparing the way for future separation. This stage carries a sense of quiet transformation. There are no abrupt shifts in the overall form, no immediate fragmentation that redefines the map. Instead, the changes unfold beneath the surface and along subtle lines, gradually reshaping the structure of the crust. The unity of the supercontinent persists, but it is no longer as stable as it once was. Through these early signs, the first hints of a different configuration begin to emerge. The land, though still whole, carries within it the beginnings of separation, guided by processes that continue to operate beyond the surface. The earliest fractures do not remain narrow for long. Over immense spans of time, the stretching of the crust continues, and the initial breaks widen into more defined zones of separation. What once appeared as a line within the land becomes a region of movement, where opposing sides begin to drift apart at a pace that is almost imperceptible, yet steady and persistent. As the crust pulls away, the space between the separating blocks deepens and evolves. The surface subsides, forming elongated basins that extend along the length of the rift. These basins begin to collect sediments, layer upon layer, recording the gradual change in their structure. The land on either side retains its connection for a time, but the distance between them increases, creating a growing divide that signals a shift in the underlying configuration. Beneath these widening regions, the interior continues to influence the process. Heat and material rise into the thinning crust, contributing to further weakening. In some areas, molten rock moves upward and solidifies, adding new material to the forming boundary. This activity does not occur in a single event, but through repeated episodes that gradually reshape the zone of separation. As the process continues, the rift can deepen to the point where it begins to resemble an early ocean basin. The crust at the center becomes thinner, and in certain regions, it may transition into a different type of surface altogether. New material forms between the separating continents, creating a boundary that is no longer simply a stretched section of land, but the beginning of a distinct division. Water can enter these developing basins, further transforming their character. What was once a continuous surface of land becomes interrupted by narrow bodies of water that expand slowly over time. These early seas mark a stage where the separation becomes more visible, though the process remains gradual and incomplete. The movement of the continents does not accelerate suddenly. It continues at a measured pace, with each increment of separation adding to the overall change. The fragments that were once joined begin to follow their own paths, guided by the same deep forces that shaped their earlier convergence. The original unity fades, replaced by a configuration that is increasingly divided. This transition does not erase the history of connection. The edges that now face one another across widening spaces still carry the marks of their former contact. Their structures, compositions, and sequences of events remain linked, even as distance grows between them. The separation becomes another layer in the story, added to the earlier phases of assembly. Over millions of years, the developing basins can expand into full oceanic regions, establishing new boundaries that redefine the arrangement of the continents. What began as a narrow fracture evolves into a feature that reshapes the planet's surface, altering the pathways of water, the distribution of land, and the interactions between different regions. The breaking of a supercontinent unfolds as a slow transformation rather than a sudden event. It is a process that takes place across vast stretches of time, where each stage leads gradually into the next. The land does not disappear, but it changes form, moving from unity toward separation through a series of quiet, persistent shifts. In this way, the dissolution of Rodinia reflects the same continuity that marked its formation. The forces that once brought its pieces together continue to act, guiding them into new arrangements. The change is steady, unfolding over time, reshaping the surface without ever coming to an abrupt conclusion. In certain regions where the crust was already under strain, a different signal began to appear, one marked not by quiet separation alone, but by the movement of heat toward the surface. Beneath these zones, material from deeper within the planet found pathways upward, following weaknesses that had formed as the land stretched. This ascent did not happen everywhere, but where it did, it altered the character of the landscape in a more visible way. Molten rock rising from below carries both heat and motion, and when it approaches the surface, it reveals that the crust above is no longer stable in the same way it once was. The presence of magma indicates that the boundary between deeper and shallower layers has become more permeable, allowing material to pass through. This movement marks areas where the crust is under significant stress, where forces have opened channels that did not exist before. As magma reaches higher levels, it can spread beneath the surface or break through it, forming volcanic features that leave lasting traces. These events may occur in sequences, with repeated flows building layers over time. The rock that forms from this activity differs from the surrounding material, creating distinct zones that can later be identified and studied. Such regions serve as indicators of where the crust was actively changing during this period. In some cases, the scale of this activity becomes extensive. Large volumes of molten material can emerge over wide areas, creating what are known as large igneous provinces. These formations represent periods when the release of heat and material was particularly intense, covering significant portions of the surface with newly formed rock. Though they develop over long durations, their cumulative effect is substantial, altering both the composition and structure of the crust. The connection between this volcanic activity and the broader process of separation is direct. As the crust thins and stretches, it becomes easier for heat from below to rise. The ascending magma, in turn, can further weaken the crust, promoting additional separation. This interaction creates a feedback where the presence of magma and the process of stretching reinforce one another, gradually transforming the region. Where the separation continues to develop, these volcanic processes contribute to the formation of new surface material. As molten rock cools and solidifies, it creates fresh crust that occupies the space between the separating landmasses. Over time, this new material can expand, establishing the foundation of a developing ocean basin. The surface that once belonged to a single continuous landmass becomes divided by newly formed rock that did not exist before. This transformation reflects a deeper connection between heat, structure, and motion within the planet. The rising magma is not an isolated phenomenon, but part of the same system that drives the movement of continents. It reveals how the interior continues to influence the surface, guiding changes that reshape the arrangement of land and sea. Within the story of Rodinia, these zones of volcanic activity mark a stage where the underlying forces become more visible. The fractures that had begun to form are now accompanied by heat and material rising from below, signaling that the process of change has reached a new level of intensity. The surface responds not only through separation, but through the creation of new features that record the ongoing transformation. In this way, the presence of magma along these fractures serves as a sign of transition. It shows that the crust is no longer simply stretching, but actively interacting with the deeper layers of the planet, allowing the interior to leave its mark on the evolving surface. Where separation continues long enough, the character of the boundary changes again, no longer defined only by fracture or heat, but by the quiet arrival of water into spaces that did not exist before. Narrow basins widen, deepen, and begin to take on the qualities of true oceanic regions. What had once been a line within a continent becomes a corridor filled with seawater, marking a transformation that reshapes the surface in lasting ways. As these basins expand, the edges of the separating land evolve into new types of margins. The intense activity that accompanied earlier stages begins to ease, leaving behind boundaries that are comparatively stable. These are known as passive margins, where the land no longer actively collides or pulls apart in dramatic ways, but instead settles into a slower pattern of subsidence and sediment accumulation. Along these edges, the crust gradually cools and sinks, allowing layers of sediment to build over time. The newly formed ocean basin between the continents continues to grow as fresh crust develops at its center. This material spreads outward, carrying the opposing landmasses farther apart. The process unfolds steadily, with each increment of new crust adding to the width of the ocean. Over immense spans, what began as a narrow separation can become a vast expanse of water, wide enough to obscure any immediate sense that the continents were once joined. Despite this growing distance, the former connection is not entirely lost. The shapes of the opposing margins can still reflect their earlier alignment, though often in ways that are subtle and altered by time. Geological features along these edges, including rock types and structural patterns, can reveal a shared history. When these features are compared across modern oceans, they sometimes match in ways that suggest a past continuity now separated by great distances. Many of today's continental margins preserve elements of this earlier stage. Beneath layers of sediment and along submerged edges, the record of ancient separation remains. These regions carry the imprint of the transition from connected land to divided continents, holding evidence of how the crust stretched, thinned, and eventually gave way to the formation of new oceanic space. As Rodinia broke apart, its fragments did not simply drift away in isolation. The spaces that opened between them became the beginnings of new oceans, shaping the arrangement of land and water that would define later periods. Each basin that formed contributed to a new configuration, influencing how currents moved, how climates developed, and how environments evolved across the planet. This transformation illustrates how the breakup of a supercontinent does more than divide land. It creates new domains that become central to future systems, establishing boundaries and connections that did not previously exist. The oceans that emerge from these ancient cracks are not temporary features, but enduring parts of the planet's surface, persisting long after the original landmass has been dispersed. In this way, the dissolution of Rodinia becomes a source of new beginnings. The fractures that once signaled instability give rise to structures that shape the planet in lasting ways. The continents that separate carry forward the memory of their connection, while the oceans between them mark the space where that connection was transformed into something new. In the wake of separation, a quieter and more uncertain thread begins to appear, one that connects shifting land to changes that reach far beyond geography. It does not present itself as a clear sequence, but as a pattern that emerges when different records are placed side by side. The timing of events, the arrangement of continents, and the state of the planet's systems begin to overlap in ways that suggest a deeper connection. As Rodinia continued to come apart, the surface of the Earth was not only rearranged, it was exposed in new ways. Fresh rock appeared along expanding margins, surfaces that had not previously been in contact with the atmosphere. These newly exposed regions interacted with air and water, entering cycles that could gradually alter the balance of gases above and within the oceans. Over long spans, such interactions have the potential to influence the broader climate system, though the exact pathways remain complex. At roughly the same distant interval, the planet entered a series of profound cooling events during the Neoproterozoic era, periods when ice extended far beyond what is seen in more recent times. Evidence for these glaciations appears in rocks that formed near the equator, indicating that cold conditions reached into regions that are typically warm. These intervals stand out in the geological record, marking moments when the climate shifted dramatically. The proximity in time between the breakup of Rodinia and these glacial episodes has drawn attention from those who study the deep past. It suggests that the rearrangement of continents may have contributed to the conditions that allowed such cooling to occur. As landmasses separated and new ocean basins formed, the patterns of circulation in both the atmosphere and the oceans would have changed. These shifts could influence how heat was distributed across the planet, affecting long-term climate behavior. At the same time, the increase in exposed rock surfaces may have enhanced processes that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through chemical reactions. This gradual drawdown could reduce the greenhouse effect, allowing temperatures to fall over extended periods. Yet this is only one part of a larger system, where volcanic activity, ocean chemistry, and biological processes also play roles. The interactions are intricate, and no single factor can fully account for the changes observed. Because of this complexity, the connection between Rodinia's breakup and these glacial intervals remains an area of ongoing discussion. Different models emphasize different mechanisms, and the balance between them is still being explored. The evidence supports a relationship in timing and potential influence, but the precise sequence of causes and effects is not fixed into a single explanation. Within this uncertainty, a broader perspective emerges. The rearrangement of the planet's surface, the circulation of its atmosphere and oceans, and the balance of its chemical systems are all intertwined. Changes in one domain can ripple through others, creating outcomes that are not immediately obvious when viewed in isolation. In this context, the breaking of Rodinia becomes part of a larger transformation, one that extends beyond the movement of continents. The shifting of land may have contributed to conditions that allowed the planet to enter one of its coldest known states. The scale of this possibility reflects the depth of connection between geological processes and climate, where the reorganization of the surface can influence the environment in ways that unfold over immense spans of time. Changes in climate do not arise from a single switch being turned, but from a gradual adjustment of many connected processes, each influencing the others over long spans of time. When a supercontinent begins to separate, the arrangement of land across the planet shifts in ways that alter how these processes interact. The surface becomes more divided, creating new boundaries where land meets water and exposing fresh material to the atmosphere. As continents fragment, the total length of their margins increases. More coastline means more regions where rock is in direct contact with air and water, and these conditions encourage chemical weathering. Minerals within the rock react with moisture and atmospheric gases, gradually breaking down and releasing elements into the surrounding environment. Over extended periods, these reactions can draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, transferring it into dissolved forms that eventually settle into the oceans. This gradual removal of carbon dioxide influences the balance of heat within the atmosphere. With less of this gas available to trap energy, the planet can lose heat more readily, allowing temperatures to shift downward over time. The effect is not immediate, but accumulates slowly, shaped by the rate at which weathering occurs and the extent of exposed surfaces across the continents. At the same time, the creation of new ocean basins introduces additional complexity. As seafloor spreads and fresh crust forms, it interacts with seawater in ways that can both add and remove chemical components from the ocean. Hydrothermal systems circulate water through hot rock, altering its composition and influencing the balance of elements that participate in larger cycles. These processes operate alongside weathering, contributing to a network of exchanges that link land, ocean, and atmosphere. Volcanic activity also plays a role within this system. As magma rises and erupts, it releases gases that can replenish carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This input can counterbalance the effects of weathering, preventing the system from shifting too far in one direction. The interplay between removal and addition creates a dynamic equilibrium, where the overall state of the atmosphere reflects the combined influence of multiple processes rather than a single dominant factor. The arrangement of continents determines how these mechanisms are distributed across the planet. When land is gathered, certain processes are concentrated in specific regions, while others are limited by distance. When that land disperses, the same processes become more widespread, interacting in new ways. The distribution of coastlines, the exposure of fresh rock, and the configuration of ocean basins all contribute to how efficiently these exchanges occur. This means that the breakup of a supercontinent does more than alter geography. It changes the pathways through which chemical interactions take place, influencing how quickly elements move between different parts of the Earth system. These shifts can affect the long-term balance of atmospheric gases, which in turn shapes climate over extended durations. Within this framework, climate emerges as the result of interconnected systems adjusting to a new configuration. The separation of land introduces new surfaces, new boundaries, and new patterns of interaction, each contributing to the overall outcome. No single process determines the result on its own. Instead, the combined effect of weathering, volcanic activity, and oceanic exchange creates a response that unfolds gradually, reflecting the complexity of the planet's evolving structure. For a long time, this stretch of Earth's history was given a quiet label, as though little of consequence unfolded across its immense duration. The phrase suggested stillness, a prolonged interval where change seemed minimal when compared to more dramatic chapters that followed. Yet the deeper one looks, the more that impression begins to soften, replaced by a sense of motion that had simply been difficult to recognize. Much of this perception arose from the nature of the record itself. The traces left behind from this time are less direct, more altered, and often harder to interpret than those from later periods. Without easily recognizable markers, it became easy to assume that less had occurred. The absence of familiar signals gave the impression of calm, even though the underlying systems of the planet continued to evolve. The reconstruction of Rodinia offers a different perspective. It reveals a surface in transition where continents were assembling, interacting, and eventually beginning to separate again. These processes required immense spans of time, unfolding at a pace that does not leave sharp boundaries between events. Instead, they form a continuous sequence where one phase gradually gives way to another without a clear dividing line. At the same time, the environments associated with this period were also shifting. The arrangement of land influenced how oceans circulated, how elements moved through the Earth system, and how conditions developed across different regions. Subtle changes in chemistry, structure, and distribution accumulated over time, creating a dynamic backdrop for the processes that shaped the planet's surface. The idea of stillness begins to dissolve when these factors are considered together. The apparent quiet of the record reflects the difficulty of preserving and interpreting evidence from such deep time rather than an actual absence of activity. Beneath that surface impression, the planet was engaged in a complex set of interactions, linking its interior, surface, and surrounding systems in ways that continue to be explored. Rodinia's story illustrates this complexity. Its formation, existence, and eventual breakup represent a sequence of events that required coordination across multiple domains. The movement of continents, the behavior of the mantle, the exchange of materials between land and ocean, and the gradual evolution of life all intersected during this interval. Each of these processes contributed to a broader pattern that defines the character of the time. Seen in this light, the period becomes less about what is missing and more about what is hidden. The evidence is present, though often transformed, requiring careful interpretation to reveal its meaning. What once appeared as a quiet chapter begins to show layers of activity, each one adding depth to the overall narrative. This shift in perspective changes how the interval is understood. Rather than viewing it as uneventful, it can be seen as a phase where processes unfolded in ways that were less immediately visible, but no less significant. The changes that occurred were gradual, interconnected, and often subtle, yet they shaped the conditions that would influence later developments. Through the lens of Rodinia, the planet appears not as a static world, but as one that remained active throughout this time. The label that once suggested simplicity gives way to a recognition of complexity, where the absence of clear signals does not imply a lack of change, but points instead to the challenges of uncovering a deeper and more continuous history. In the quiet intervals between shifting continents and changing seas, the conditions that support life can gather in subtle ways, almost unnoticed at first. No single moment announces a transformation, yet over long spans, small adjustments begin to accumulate, shaping the possibilities that lie ahead. Within the era shaped by Rodinia, these gradual changes form a backdrop where the foundations for later biological complexity may have been quietly arranged. The arrangement of land and water influences how nutrients move through the planet. As continents shift and fracture, fresh surfaces of rock are exposed to wind, rain, and flowing water. Over time, these surfaces release elements into rivers and eventually into the oceans. This steady supply of materials can alter the balance of nutrients available to microscopic life, encouraging new patterns of growth in places where conditions become favorable. Shallow marine environments play a particularly important role in this slow process. Where continents meet the sea, wide continental shelves can develop, creating regions where sunlight, water, and nutrients intersect. These zones offer a setting where simple organisms can thrive in large numbers, interacting with one another and with their surroundings in increasingly complex ways. Such environments do not guarantee new forms of life, yet they provide opportunities where change can take hold. Ocean circulation also responds to the shifting layout of continents. As land masses gather or separate, pathways for currents are redirected, influencing how heat and dissolved substances move across the globe. These currents help distribute nutrients and gases, linking distant regions of the ocean into a connected system. Over time, this circulation can affect the chemical character of the seas, shaping the conditions in which life persists. Within this evolving setting, the biosphere remains dominated by simple forms, yet it is not static. Microbial communities interact with their environment, influencing and responding to changes in chemistry. These interactions can lead to gradual shifts in the availability of oxygen and other key elements, setting the stage for new possibilities without forcing them into immediate existence. It is important to see Rodinia's role in this story as part of a broader sequence rather than a direct cause. The assembly and breakup of a supercontinent do not act as a switch that suddenly produces complexity. Instead, they influence a network of processes that unfold over extended periods. The rearrangement of continents, the exposure of fresh rock, the expansion of shallow seas, and the reorganization of ocean circulation all contribute to a changing planetary system. As these processes continue, they create conditions that may later support more intricate forms of life. The timing of these developments suggests a connection, yet the relationship remains one of influence rather than certainty. Many factors interact within the Earth system, and no single element can fully account for the emergence of complexity. Seen from this perspective, Rodinia becomes part of a longer preparation, a phase where the planet adjusts its surface and internal systems in ways that gradually expand what is possible. The changes are quiet and extended, unfolding across millions of years, yet they leave an imprint that can be traced in the record of rocks and sediments. What emerges is not a single turning point, but a gentle accumulation of conditions. The world shaped by Rodinia does not produce complexity on its own, yet it contributes to the setting in which later developments can occur. In this way, the story remains open, grounded in evidence, yet still unfolding as new connections are explored within the deep history of Earth. On a table scattered with maps that never fully agree, the shape of Rodinia appears and dissolves again and again. Each version feels close to something real, yet none settles into a single, final arrangement. The outlines shift slightly, the positions rotate, and the spaces between continents open or close by degrees that matter more than they first seem. Part of this uncertainty begins with direction itself. Ancient rocks can preserve hints of where they once stood relative to the poles, but their position around the planet, their east and west placement, remains far less certain. This missing sense of rotation, often called paleolongitude, leaves room for multiple possibilities. A continent may sit at the correct latitude, yet still turn freely around the globe in different reconstructions, creating maps that are each plausible in their own way. Time adds another layer of complexity. The rocks that carry these signals have endured immense spans, during which they have been buried, heated, stretched, and folded. These processes can alter or partially erase the original information, leaving fragments that must be interpreted with care. What survives is rarely a complete record. Instead, it resembles a collection of scattered pages, each one offering a glimpse but never the full story. Even when continents are compared across great distances, the evidence does not always align neatly. Mountain belts that seem to match may have been modified by later events. Sedimentary sequences can hint at shared histories, yet gaps in the record leave room for alternative connections. Radiometric ages provide anchors in time, but they do not always reveal how pieces once fit together in space. Because of this, different research groups can agree on the broad sequence of events while still arranging the details in distinct ways. They may recognize similar collisions, similar periods of assembly, and similar phases of separation, yet place individual landmasses in slightly different positions or orientations. These variations do not arise from contradiction alone, but from the limits of the available evidence and the methods used to interpret it. The map of Rodinia becomes less like a single image and more like a range of possibilities constrained by data. Certain configurations can be ruled out, while others remain open, each supported by a combination of clues that fit together with varying degrees of confidence. Over time, new discoveries may narrow these options, refining the picture without fully closing it. This ongoing debate reflects the nature of the science itself. The absence of a definitive answer does not weaken the work, but instead reveals its honesty. Researchers are not reconstructing a world that can be directly observed. They are building it from traces that have been transformed by the passage of deep time, testing each interpretation against the evidence that remains. In this way, uncertainty becomes part of the process rather than an obstacle to it. It allows multiple ideas to be explored, compared, and gradually improved as new information emerges. The shifting maps of Rodinia are not signs of confusion, but of a field that continues to refine its understanding, moving carefully between what is known and what can only be inferred. The result is a portrait that remains open, shaped by both evidence and interpretation. It carries the marks of a world that cannot be seen directly, yet can still be approached through patient reconstruction. In that space between certainty and possibility, Rodinia persists as a map that is still being drawn, its final form held just beyond complete agreement. After the great landmass had loosened into separate pieces, the story did not settle into stillness. The fragments carried with them the memory of earlier unions, drifting across the surface in slow, deliberate paths, shaped by forces that continued far beneath. What had once been joined now moved apart, yet each piece retained a history that would influence where it would go next. These drifting continents did not remain isolated for long. Over immense spans, their journeys began to intersect again, guided by patterns of motion that repeated across deep time. Edges that had once faced a common interior would later encounter new neighbors, forming connections that had never existed before. The rearrangement was gradual, but it carried a sense of continuity, as though the earlier world had not vanished, but instead transformed into a new configuration. Among these evolving patterns, certain groupings began to emerge. Some fragments gathered into larger assemblies that would eventually contribute to what is now recognized as Gondwana. This formation did not appear suddenly, but grew through a sequence of contacts and adjustments, each one adding to a structure that would become more stable over time. Pieces that had once belonged to Rodinia found themselves part of this new arrangement, their past connections echoing quietly within a different framework. Far beyond this stage, other movements continued, extending the chain of reorganization even further. The drifting fragments, shaped by earlier events, would participate in later assemblies that culminated in Pangea. This much younger supercontinent, more familiar in its outline, carried within it the inherited structure of worlds that came before. The pathways that led to its formation were not isolated events, but part of a continuous sequence that stretched back through earlier cycles. In this sense, Rodinia's legacy did not end with its separation. Its fragments became the building blocks of future continents, carrying with them the results of earlier collisions, deformations, and histories of connection. These inherited traits influenced how later landmasses interacted, where boundaries formed, and how new arrangements took shape. Each phase of assembly drew upon the conditions created by previous ones, forming a chain that linked distant eras together. The surface of the planet thus becomes a kind of archive, where present configurations are shaped by layers of earlier arrangements. What appears as a new map is, in part, a reworking of older structures, adjusted and reconnected over time. The continents that exist today are not entirely new creations, but mosaics assembled from pieces that have been carried through multiple cycles of change. This perspective softens the sense of loss that might surround a vanished supercontinent. Rodinia does not disappear entirely, but persists through the materials and structures that continue to move across the globe. Its presence can be traced not as a single intact form, but as a set of influences that extend into later worlds, shaping their development in ways that are often subtle, yet enduring. As these fragments continued their journeys, the planet remained in motion, guided by processes that do not pause. The sequence of assembly and separation continued, each phase building upon the last, each configuration preparing the conditions for what would follow. In this ongoing pattern, Rodinia becomes one chapter within a much longer narrative, its influence carried forward through the continents that followed, quietly embedded within the evolving surface of Earth. There is a quiet shift that happens once Rodinia settles into view, not as a fixed map, but as a presence within the long movement of the planet. It changes the sense of scale, stretching the timeline outward until familiar reference points begin to feel closer together than they once did. What seemed distant becomes recent, and what seemed foundational reveals itself as part of a much older sequence. This change begins with time itself. Rodinia occupies a place so far back that it gently rearranges how later events are perceived. The formations that often anchor the imagination no longer stand at the beginning, but somewhere along a continuing path. The planet's history opens outward, revealing that what is commonly remembered represents only a later phase in an ongoing process. At the same time, Rodinia sits near a convergence of transitions that shaped the Earth in lasting ways. The arrangement of continents influenced how the interior and surface interacted, guiding movements that would continue to unfold long after its structure dissolved. Oceans responded to these changes, adjusting circulation and chemistry in ways that altered the conditions in which life persisted. Climate, too, was tied to these shifting patterns, responding to arrangements that redistributed heat and material across the globe. These connections do not form a single, simple chain, but rather a network of influences that overlap and interact. Rodinia becomes significant not because it explains everything that followed, but because it occupies a position where many threads come together. It represents a phase where the planet's systems were aligned in a particular way, shaping the possibilities that would emerge later. Seen in this light, its importance grows quietly. It does not rely on dramatic visibility or clear outlines preserved in the present landscape. Instead, it rests in the relationships it reveals between continents and oceans, between deep interior motion and surface expression, between environmental change and the evolving biosphere. Each of these connections adds depth to the understanding of how Earth operates over immense spans. The familiarity of later supercontinents can make them feel like starting points, yet Rodinia gently shifts that perception. It shows that the processes responsible for assembling and dispersing landmasses were already active long before those later configurations took shape. The patterns observed in younger formations are part of a repeating rhythm, one that extends further back than it first appears. This recognition brings a different kind of clarity. The planet is not defined by a single arrangement or a single turning point, but by continuous transformation. Each phase carries forward elements of what came before, while also setting conditions for what will follow. Rodinia occupies one of these phases, not isolated, but deeply connected within the broader flow. Its relative obscurity becomes part of its character. It remains less familiar, less easily pictured, yet this distance invites a closer look at the underlying processes rather than the surface details alone. The absence of a widely recognized image allows the focus to rest on how the planet changes rather than on any single configuration. In this way, Rodinia offers a kind of quiet perspective. It broadens the sense of Earth's history, deepens the connections between its systems, and reminds that what is most influential is not always what is most visible. The significance it holds is not announced loudly, but revealed through the gradual expansion of understanding, where the planet's past becomes wider, older, and more intricately connected than it first appears. There is a certain stillness in the way a map is usually held in the mind, as if the outlines it shows have always been there and will remain long after. Yet the deeper story suggests something quieter and more fluid, where the shapes we recognize are only brief arrangements within a much longer sequence. The continents do not rest in place, even when their motion escapes immediate notice, and the ground beneath them carries a history that stretches far beyond any single configuration. Across vast spans, oceans have opened where none existed before, widening slowly until they separate lands that were once joined. Elsewhere, these same oceans have narrowed, their basins consumed as continents drift back together. The process unfolds without urgency, measured not in moments, but in intervals so long that the beginning and end of each phase blend into one another. What appears stable within a human lifetime is, in this broader context, part of a continuous transformation. Mountains follow a similar rhythm. They rise when continents meet, their peaks lifted by forces that reshape the crust, then gradually wear down under the influence of wind, water, and time. What was once elevated becomes subdued, its remnants folded into the landscape in ways that can be difficult to recognize. The absence of these structures in the present does not mean they never existed, only that they have been altered beyond easy identification. Continents themselves are not fixed entities, but shifting collections of older pieces that come together and separate again. Their boundaries change, their positions drift, and their relationships evolve. Each arrangement reflects a moment within a cycle rather than a final state. The world that feels familiar is one version among many, shaped by processes that have been active for far longer than human memory can hold. The sense of permanence arises naturally from the scale of human experience. Lifetimes are short compared to the motions of the planet, and so the ground seems steady, the coastlines enduring. Maps reinforce this impression, presenting a snapshot that appears complete and unchanging. Yet beneath this surface, the forces that reshape the Earth continue their work, gradually altering the arrangement that seems so stable. Rodinia and other lost supercontinents reveal this larger pattern. They show that the present configuration is not a starting point, but a continuation. Earlier worlds have assembled and dispersed, leaving traces that persist even as their overall shapes fade. These traces influence what follows, guiding the formation of new arrangements while carrying forward elements of the past. The lesson that emerges is not one of sudden change, but of ongoing motion. The planet is neither fixed nor chaotic, but engaged in a steady process of reorganization. Each phase builds upon those that came before, creating a sequence that extends across immense spans of time. The landscapes that seem enduring are part of this sequence, shaped by events that may no longer be visible but still matter. In this quiet perspective, the Earth appears both stable and in motion at once. Its surface holds familiar forms, yet these forms are temporary, shaped by processes that continue beyond the limits of direct observation. The recognition of this balance brings a sense of scale, where the present becomes one moment within a much larger story, and the map itself becomes a passing expression of a planet that is always changing. Somewhere beneath the familiar outline of the present world, there lingers the faint presence of a land that is rarely pictured, yet quietly woven into everything that followed. Rodinia does not hold the same place in memory as later supercontinents, and its absence from common imagination gives it a different kind of weight. It exists more as a reconstruction than a recollection, a world assembled from traces rather than remembered scenes. That distance gives it a certain stillness. It belongs to a time so far removed that even well-known chapters of Earth's past begin to feel recent by comparison. The continents that shape current maps, the coastlines that appear stable, and the environments that feel familiar all rest upon foundations that extend far deeper than they seem. Rodinia occupies part of that depth, influencing patterns that would continue to unfold long after its form had changed. Its importance is not always visible in direct ways. Instead, it appears through connections, in the way continents later align, in the pathways oceans have taken, and in the gradual unfolding of conditions that shaped the planet's surface. These connections do not point back to a single moment, but to a sequence of changes that carried forward across immense spans. The world that exists now carries echoes of those earlier arrangements, even when their original shape is no longer clear. There is something quietly striking in the idea that some of the most influential phases of Earth's history remain difficult to picture. The further back the story reaches, the more it depends on fragments, interpretation, and careful reconstruction. What is absent from common memory is not empty, but filled with events that shaped everything that followed, even if they are not easily seen. Rodinia becomes a reminder of this hidden depth. It suggests that the planet has held many forms, each one part of a longer sequence that continues beyond any single map. The familiar arrangement of land and sea is only one version among many, shaped by processes that extend far beyond the scale of human experience. The past is not a simple line of well defined stages, but a layered record where some chapters remain faint and others more visible. As the story settles, the image that remains is not of a fixed world, but of one that has changed again and again, each phase leaving behind traces that blend into what follows. Rodinia stands as one of those phases, distant yet influential, its presence carried forward through the structure of the continents and the patterns of the planet itself. If one part of this journey lingers more than others, it may be the shifting map, the slow separation, the links to changing climate, or simply the scale of time that stretches far beyond ordinary reference. Each of these threads offers a different way of seeing the same world, revealing how much of it remains beyond immediate view. For those drawn to these quiet stories, there is always more to explore. If this glimpse into Earth's deeper past resonated, consider sharing which moments stayed with you and continue following along for more explorations that unfold slowly, revealing a planet that is wider, older, and more intricate than it first appears.